Welcome to Movie Menu Classics, your go-to podcast for classic cinema. We are your hosts. I'm Heather.
I'm Vasthi.
And each episode, we're going to be discussing, spoiler-free, of our favorite classic films. We'll be sharing why we recommend these films, along with some fun facts. Join us as we revisit the classics we love. Today, we're going to be discussing two films, Bambi and Lady and the Tramp, in our animated podcast. Today we're discussing our favorite classic animated films. First up is Bambi, and that was recommended by Vasthi.
Hello. So all of my close friends will not be surprised whatsoever that I picked Bambi. I picked it because it was the only Disney movie I owned. I was a huge fan of Disney, but because of my household and my grandma's strict rules on not owning anything that had to do with like magic, and it really all stemmed from her religious upbringing of me. Bambi was the only one I was allowed to have, and I ended up watching it to I know every musical cue. I know everything about this film that and I love it. I could have easily gone one way or the other, where I just got sick of it, but I didn't. This is also the same grandmother that introduced me to National Geographic films really young. So I was very familiar with the themes of nature, survival of the fittest, seeing death on camera. It was all very familiar to me. So I was aware that what the rules were in terms of nature. And so while certain famous scenes did upset me, it didn't traumatize me like some audience members might have remembered. I think everyone just remembers what happens in this film and nothing else. And many have probably not seen it since. But I would say revisit this film, especially if you haven't seen it as a kid, just because there's just so much more about this film. It's a coming of age story to its truest form without the musical numbers that Disney is really associated with, like where people just break into song right away. This is probably like, I would say even like a precursor to like the nature film or the nature studies being caught on camera. I'd say this is probably one of the most realistic animated studies of movement. I could go on, and I actually intend to go on and on. So let's start with the basics. This movie came out in 1942. And just for some historical context, I'll just rattle off a couple of things that were happening at the time. The Declaration of the United Nations was signed by 26 nations. The U.S. military developed duct tape. We're full on in the middle of World War II. So unfortunately, this is 1942 was when the mass murders at Auschwitz have officially begun. Casablanca premiered. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was established in the U.S., and the first nuclear reactor was created. So this is definitely like a turning point in the type of new world we're about to go into, not just for American history, but for the world. I think Bambi was way ahead of its time in terms of, again, conservation, animal activism. It was initially a box office bomb in its first run in 1942 because it obviously couldn't reach the European market in the middle of World War II. So it heavily relied on the domestic market, and people were just not in the mood to watch a story about a deer. But it eventually made up more than doubled its money in its subsequent re-releases in 1947, 57, 1966, 75, 82, and 1988. Re-releases were something that Disney films did a lot before the advent of like the home video. So this wasn't uncommon at all. It earned 3 Oscar nominations and didn't win any of them. It was nominated for Best Dramatic Score for a comedy or dramatic picture. It lost to Now Voyager. It was nominated for Best Song, which is the opening title of the film, Love Is a Song. It lost to White Christmas. And it was nominated for Best Sound Recording, and it lost to Yankee Doodle Dandy. So it had some fierce competition. And just a quick fun fact about the only award that Walt Disney walked away with that year was for Best Animated Short, called Der Fuhrer's Face, which it's on YouTube. It's spelled DERFUEHRER's Face. It is a propaganda film, and I highly recommend everybody YouTube it and make your own conclusions. It's jarring to watch, but it's absolutely necessary. And we'll be discussing some of the racial stains that Disney has definitely made in its history. So just a little side note, definitely watch The Freer's Face on YouTube. Won an Academy Award for Best Animated Short. Just keep that in mind when you do watch that. Bambi was based on the 1923 novel Bambi, A Life in the Woods by Felix Salten, and it was written in the aftermath of World War I. In Nazi Germany, it was actually banned because Salten was an Austrian Jew. And unfortunately, everything written by Jews was banned in Nazi Germany. Before the Second World War, the book was an immediate hit. And when it was translated to English in 1928, by 1942, it had already sold about 650,000 copies. I would love to read it. It's something I just haven't made time for. It's not that I'm refusing. I know that it's actually much more gory. It's a story for adults. This was never intended for children. So some of the scenes, as traumatic as some of the scenes in the film are, the novel is much more real. And it's, I'm already fascinated by with what I do know that is left off of the film. So I have every intention of reading it. I just have not gotten around to it. So before I get into some of the trivia and some of the fun facts, I'm so passionate about this film. Heather, what were your thoughts rewatching this?
Man, I haven't watched Bambi since I was a kid. I thought about it, and I really don't think I've seen it since I was 7 or 8, maybe. Like, yeah, it is definitely something I saw, but it wasn't, I don't know. For some reason, it didn't stick in the favorites pile that I watched over and over again. I think maybe because it is a little dark, and like stuff like Old Yeller, like I couldn't ever watch again. And like E.T. scared me, so it wasn't things I watched over and over again. I stuck to like the feel good ones, or at least for me. But it was interesting rewatching it. There was a lot of things I forgot about this film, actually. The really memorable scenes and the things you kind of see over and over again is like young Bambi meeting Thumper and Flower and that kind of stuff. It was more of like the second half of the film, all of the plot points that happened there. I kind of forgot all of them. And I didn't realize the turning point was also so far in the film. Like the first traumatic incidents that happens to Bambi, I always kind of felt like was near the beginning, and I don't know why. Rewatching it, I was surprised at how far into the film. It was like halfway through. But I was really impressed with the art. I was really impressed with the music. And it reminded me of Fantasia in the sense that it's animation to music. And like you said, it's not so much, the characters having musical numbers. It's more animation to music. And I love Fantasia because I love, if you really listen to music and you like close your eyes, you can picture a whole scene. And Disney was so good at that. And he really loved putting art and music together. So that's something that this is like a classic art piece film. Like it was really beautifully done. And 100%. The techniques they use. Yeah, I know this is like what they did with Snow White, where they had like the layered. I've seen a couple like documentary things on it where they used like different layered storyboards to move so that you can see that it actually is almost 3D, or there's different, like the foreground and the background really do feel like they're on different planes, and that because they actually filmed it with different planes. So it was groundbreaking animation at the time.
I'm glad you described it as art, because that is something I swore that was gonna fly out of my mouth within the opening minutes. Is like, this is such a work of art. I had the privilege of watching it on the big screen only once, at the El Capitan Theater, and I had been stalking that their schedule for years and years and years, and they've just never brought it. And so when it did, I'm like, I am canceling all my plans. I'm going. My husband ended up going with me, and it's even more spectacular on the big screen. It, to no surprise, it was inducted to the Library of Congress Film and, Registry, which only 19 Disney films have been inducted so far, which when you think about how many Disney films there are, that's not a whole lot. 19
Mm-hmm.
sounds like a lot, but it's really not. In, I believe, 2011, it was inducted. Some of the techniques are just, it blows me away. It's just so artistically stunning, whether it's the realism, or some of my favorite scenes are the ones with real tension in it, whether it's when Bambi gets lost the first time and everything's, I wouldn't say abstract, but there is an element that of artistry that comes from Fantasia, which actually came 2 years prior. But actually, Walt Disney ended up working on this for about 9 years. This was his all-time favorite film to work on, and he wanted this to be his first film. But it just kept getting pushed back. The ideas kept changing. At first, he wanted this to be like a live action, and everybody's like, "What are you talking about? You're insane. That's never gonna work." Um, There's so many different departments in this. All the animators got sent back to like, um, oh, I'm sorry. To study anatomy and animal movements, and animals were brought in to live animals just to witness how they observe how they moved, and cadavers were brought in just to see how they decomposed and where the muscle structures were. And one thing so my husband's from a rural area in Michigan where hunting is just part of the culture. And one thing, upon me forcing him to rewatch it, he's like, that's exactly how deer move. Um, and was really impressed just by something like that. So it took about 9 years to complete. So Walt Disney's interpretation is after the North American mule deer, but in the book, he's actually a European roe deer. It's not that big of a deal to the common audience, but to those who study taxidermy and know the differences, that would be a pretty big deal if you took a different type of breed and placed them in a different setting. This film's only the dialogue is one of the fewest of any of the Disney films. I don't believe it's the fewest. I think maybe Dumbo might have been even fewer, but there's only like 950 words spoken in the entire film. And this really is just about the cycle of life. After watching the trailer, they really try to market this as a love story in like the romantic sense, and I couldn't disagree more. I think this is about, to borrow from The Lion King, this is really about the circle of life and going through the trials and tribulations of loss, of really just having this informal education, just receiving these vague answers to everything and just having to figure it out. I think that's the thing, as an only child growing up and just having this one movie to watch over and over and over. That's what I connected with, was he's just trying to figure the world out and surviving. And to me, that makes it so valuable in my upbringing. And I don't know the number of who else it would have affected in that way, but that's on top of the artistry. I just think it's such a amazing story of survival and nature. Some of the movements I don't think I've seen in other films. Like when, I think of a mouse, we all think either Fievel or Cinderella or whatever, but you see these little forest mice just brushing themselves in a rainstorm. It's mind-blowing how intricate some of these artistic cells are. They were done in oil paint, which I don't know if it would surprise anybody, but if you've ever worked with oil paints, it is such a pain to work with. And I cannot fathom how hard this must have been, how intricate this must have been to complete. And so I could imagine it was so disappointing to release it at the time that it was, in the middle of World War II and basically losing money in its first run, because it really deserves so much more than that. And I'm glad it eventually got its due, but it still leaves me speechless when I really stop and look and appreciate the art and the movement. I could go on and on about this.
It's definitely a beautifully done film, and I really love it. It is really coming of age. I love watching him discover the world. It's so cute. The movie is so darn cute. Like especially the first half when he's little, and you're really with him experiencing every little new thing. And even his little like Thumper's watching him and laughing at how like silly he is and how he's learning what it is. Like, no, silly, that's not what it is. This is what it is.
It also reminds me of like how brutally honest some kids are. And
Yeah.
if you're ever around kids or have worked with kids, they'll just say the most inappropriate things sometimes, not because they're mean, but they're just curious and they just learn. They're like, well, what are you doing? That's not how you walk. So I love that about Thumper, even though as an adult, I'm like, God, he's so annoying. But he really is a representation of so many kids at that age that are just honest and just are asking these blunt questions, and that's him. So a quick fun fact about the actors who played Bambi and Thumper. So the voice of young Bambi, that was his only acting job, and he actually became a career Marine, and he hid the fact that he was Bambi for most of his life until I believe one of his commanding officers like found out and kind of outed him. But then he just later in his life he really embraced it. But I just thought it was really funny how he just kept his mouth shut about it for most of his adult life, especially as a young man in the Marine Corps. You could only imagine. I could understand why he was hesitant to share that information. And as for the actor that played young Thumper, something that was mentioned, how much they struggled with him, that he couldn't really be directed. He was just so he wasn't an actor per se, but they animated around his recordings. They figured out a way how to do it, and one of the things that they had trouble with him was laughing on cue. And they ended up showing him like Mickey Mouse cartoons and just turning the mic on, and the laughter that you hear is him laughing to like Steamboat Willie or whatever they chose to show him, which I thought was such a really cute method of capturing that authentic laughter. And I'm sure that's always been the case, but off the top of my head, I can't remember a child's voice being recorded in the earlier Disney films.
I was actually reading when I was looking up about this film that it was actually very rare for children to be used as child voices, but Walt was kind of insistent upon that, even though it was really out of the norm, because he wanted, the authenticity of actual children instead of adults mimicking children.
Right.
So this was really rare. You're correct that this was not normal, and they kind of struggled with it.
Something that I thought was so fascinating So in 1943, it was still in the middle of World War II. Bambi was loaned to the U.S. Forest Service for a campaign on fire prevention. And for those who have watched the film, know that fire prevention is a huge forest fires is basically like a fourth character in this film. The Forest Service soon realized that it needed to come up with its own mascot just because of the licensing, and it was only on loan for a year. So out of that came Smokey the Bear. Was out of this temporary loan. So I thought that was so fascinating.
Oh,
I
wow,
didn't know
that's really cool.
that Smokey the Bear came after that, because I had seen some of the posters, and if you Google it, some of those posters are so cute, but I didn't realize that predated that. It predated only you can prevent forest fires. So I thought that was so fascinating.
Yeah, I think the relationship with humans in this film is really fascinating. Like man, and that's all, you never see a human. You just see evidence and hear evidence of humans, and it's just described as man. And they really are the villain in this story. It was interesting to, it's very rare that films like Disney films are completely void of humans and that they are just completely villainous.
Right.
And also I heard, I read this somewhere, I don't know how accurate it is, you can't believe everything you read on the internet, but apparently the animators used to use man is in the forest as
I read that too. Yeah.
for Disney being in the building or being in the hallways. So I thought that was cute.
That's funny. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot more gore in the book than was actually translated onto the film, and there's a specific death that was actually supposed to be included on screen, and immediately Walt Disney was shot down on that. But he was like up for the challenge, like, yeah, let's include that. And I want to say, like, he was so about pushing the boundary that I do believe that he would have been open to it if approached, if they would have been able to come up with a specific way to do it. I read that hunters naturally were furious at this film because I'm not a hunter. I don't come from a hunting family. I could see how even I know, like, from the little I know about hunting as a sport, you're not supposed to be that reckless with it. And there's a specific scene where it just seems like shots are flying everywhere and there isn't really like a target. It's just kind of like chaos, which I would interpret as that's what the animals are feeling. I don't know if it would be like a realistic take of that's how the hunters are shooting, but at the time, hunters were extremely furious. The term "the Bambi effect" was coined out of this, which translates to the objection against killing cute, adorable animals, but you don't really care about the less desirable ones. Something I thought was really cute was just basically this was really my first sex ed class at age 6, 6, 7, 8. Just learning about how silly you get when you're in love. And yes, that's not how wild animals act. There's no, I'm not going to get into that, but I remember that being my mom didn't talk to me about that. That was really my first, like, sort of seed that was implanted on, like, what happens at a certain age. So I thought about it, I'm like, I don't remember ever really talking about that ever really coming up in other Disney movies. It was just about, oh, well, there he is in the happily ever after, not about the butterflies in your stomach and feeling like you're flying on air or whatever.
Getting Twitter pated. I guess we were both talking at the same time, so we couldn't really hear the audio. Man in the forest is mentioned in the film as a description of danger. It's kind of like man is in the forest, but it's rumored that the animators in the studios used to use man in the forest as code for Walt is walking around the halls.
Get back to work. Yeah. Stop slacking, get back to work. Going on, so my 3 favorite scenes, I briefly mentioned them before, was when the meadow is first introduced. It's a very long scene of him realizing there are other deer in the forest, him suddenly knowing that, oh, there's other males, I want to start mimicking their movements, meeting his father for the first time, learning about the Great Prince and like everything that, and his role in his clan. Like, you hear the man theme for the first time, which is really tense. And it's, you know, for me, it's reminiscent of Jaws, of just that like very tense string of danger approaching. And the way that the colors suddenly become unrealistic and very abstract, that scene, along with the fight, along with this forest fire, those moments of distress, but then coming out and surviving those incidents, are probably some of my favorite, just for the music, the art, the tension. It's just I just blanked. It takes my breath away. And it just reminds me too of just times when, you know, as a kid, I remember getting lost in the supermarket for the very first time, probably like when I was at 4 years old. And so getting separated from your family just kind of, you know, brings you back to that panic of like searching for your parents and just not knowing what's going to happen. You don't know how to really articulate at that age.
Oh yeah, it is a real moment of terror. Like, I remember being at Disneyland and losing my dad for a second. Like, he just kind of like disappeared into a crowd, and there's like a moment of sheer and utter panic.
Right.
And it's just like, you really are looking around. Like, you can really put yourself in Bambi's shoes or hooves there.
Yeah.
That it's sheer panic, and you don't know what to do. Like, you're frozen and you're looking, and it's like, what now? And then for at least for that moment at Disneyland, the relief of like, oh, there he is. Okay.
Yes. Oh my God. Exactly. I think every kid could relate to that. And so I just also want to mention the way we're, you know, the way I'm going on and on about Bambi. I'm making it sound like it's this like 4-hour epic. It's an hour and 10 minutes. Like, so much happens in such a short amount of time. I think is fascinating. How well a story is told about growing up. And so I mentioned before the show to Heather that my other favorite Disney film is Beauty and the Beast. And I've watched these 2 films enough to recognize when a scene is being reused. And Disney does have this this habit of reusing certain sounds, certain background noises into other Disney films.
They'll reuse entire scenes and just animate over them.
So 2 that I recognize right off the bat, I'm like, oh my God. So the opening scene is just so reminiscent of the opening scene in Beauty and the Beast, just through the forest. Just, it's not very long, but I recognize the camera pan. I've seen it a million times. I'm like, oh, so it just makes me feel validated and happy that visually 2 of these films, one borrowed from the other. And the other one is when in Beauty and the Beast, when Beast is fighting off the wolves. Some of those very same movements are mimicked when Bambi's fighting off the hunting dogs. Everything from like, you know, standing on his hind legs, kicking them all off, and kicking the one in the throat. I'm pretty sure there has to be a side-by-side on YouTube. But those 2 scenes, I'm like, oh yeah, I know exactly where that's from. And I'm not even mad because it's amazing. And not surprisingly, Beauty and the Beast is also one of the 19 films that are registered in the Library of Congress. But this is about Bambi, not Beauty and the Beast.
Did you watch this on Disney Plus, or did you watch a copy that you own?
I watched this one on Disney Plus, but because so I've told my husband and a few other friends that there's this famous scene after the forest fire where their animals are kind of like coming to this little refuge. On the VHS version, like a raccoon disappears, like that cell just disappears. So there's this mama raccoon licking her younging, and that the young one disappears. And I noticed that they fixed that on Disney Plus. I'm like, okay, they have the budget to fix it now. But on my VHS tape, or the one that was released in 1989, it's on there. So if you have it, watch for that disappearing little raccoon after the forest fire.
Check it out. Did you watch any of the deleted scenes on Disney Plus?
No, I have not yet.
Okay, so there's a couple of deleted scenes, and I won't tell you about them, but it's interesting because you've talked about how long, or actually how short the film is, and how much stories told. Is Walt what was put in? So these deleted scenes are really cute. One of them's like a different version of Bambi discovering snow. So it was like the original concept, and then they changed it to what's in the film now. There's a couple of the deleted scenes are like other characters we would have met, but it's, as much as they're really cute and fun, it really does take away from the story being Bambi centric and moving the plot forward. And even though there's a lot of time spent on the art of the forest and sounds, and I really love, it's so reminiscent of Fantasia, is the sounds of the forest, and it really being animated in sync with the score, which is something that I really, really, really love and appreciate. But yeah, I understand why those deleted scenes were taken out, because it really does, it's unnecessary.
Right. Another super random fact that I forgot. This film is 100% responsible for Paul McCartney becoming an animal rights activist. He said it completely changed his life forever. And, you know, for those who don't know, he's famous for, aside being a Beatle, like he's famous for his animal rights, for being hardcore vegan, him and his former wife, Linda McCartney. So I thought that was such a cool tidbit that Bambi was 100% responsible for imprinting that in him, which, you know, who knows how this film influenced other people.
I could understand that completely. Watching this, I was so mad at humans and so mad at hunters, and it's just like what about the poor little lives of the creatures?
They're just minding their own business. And you know, to be fair, yes, I understand that an owl would probably have eaten and killed a bunny, a skunk, you know.
Right.
But that's as probably as fantastical as it gets, besides them talking. But I really love that this isn't your classic Disney musical where they'll just start singing. Any songs you hear are choirs or just instrumentals, even if it's like Thunder and Lightning, which I love. I love the score so much, and it's a shame that it kind of I got buried under everything that was happening that year. Something hilarious that I read in 2018, a 29-year-old hunter in Missouri who was busted for running a poaching scheme was sentenced to watch Bambi monthly during his like 1 or 2 year sentence.
I read that. I thought that was awesome.
I love it. We briefly talked before the show about sequels, and for those who do have Disney Plus, as soon as you finish watching one of the classic vaulted films, there'll be a preview for like a sequel. And there is a Bambi 2, which is where this shirt is from. I bought it at Disneyland unknowingly that it was from Bambi 2 because I didn't know it existed. I watched it, and I will say it should be called Bambi 1.5 because it's about a part 2 in his childhood. It's not bad. It's worth your time if you have the time to kill. It's not a waste. It pushes the story along. I could see why that wasn't included in the original story, but it's a nice side story about him continuing to grow up and dealing with a very huge loss in his life that molded him to start a new relationship and later become the adult he becomes. But I mean, all in all, my final thoughts on this film is, considering he's this only child who is given vague answers by everybody, whether it's about the medal, about the man, nobody's specific with him about why he shouldn't do certain things. So he's just learning as he goes, adapts quickly, survives and thrives. And that's why I love this movie on top of its artistic beauty. I highly recommend it. I would warn, if you're going to show your young children this, wait a couple of years or be ready to explain, that some people experience loss, whether it's in that way or, another way. Those are my final thoughts. I don't know. What do you think, Heather?
I think, like we covered, it's a beautiful artistic masterpiece, and it's definitely, if you haven't seen it, I feel like you need to watch it just as like historical context for animation and for early Disney. And if you saw it when you were a kid or it's been a really long time, rewatch it. You'll find something new and different. Like, there's a lot of things I didn't really pick up on as a kid, and it's also interesting. I was looking at like the relationships and the cartoon version versus like the realism of animal relationships, like the simple fact of like his dad isn't really in the picture, but he it's his dear parents don't stay together in nature.
Yeah, they're not this human unit that
right, but they were still like born of love and in this animated world. But it's interesting to rewatch, so I definitely recommend it. It's Disney classic, it's an animation classic, so you got to check it out for sure. All right, so moving on to the next film, which is one I recommended. And actually, speaking of which, I will change my background to
the
most famous scene in Lady and the Tramp. All right, so Lady and the Tramp is released June 22nd, 1955. It is rated G. It was directed by Clyde. I'm going to totally slaughter this last name, but Jerome. I'm not even going to try. Wait. Geronimi. I'm sorry, Clyde, for mispronouncing your name horribly. Wilfred Jackson and Hamilton Lusk. The story was by Ward Green, and here's the plot. The romantic tale of sheltered uptown Cocker Spaniel and streetwise downtown mutt. I guess that pretty much sums it up. It's fine. It's pretty basic. It's voiced by Barbara Luddy, Larry Roberts, and Peggy Lee. All right, so 1955. Lady
I have a couple of notes of like what was going on in 1955.
Oh, please, let's start there.
For some audience context. So Martin Luther King had just led his first major event of the civil rights movement, which was the Montgomery bus boycott, which actually really stuck out to me, seeing how this movie is such about the have and the have-nots. The AFL-CIO labor unions merge. Artificial diamonds are created. The $64,000 question was at the height of its popularity. For those who don't know, that's a really popular game show. And if you haven't watched Quiz Show, I highly recommend it. And Disneyland opened in Anaheim on July 17th, 1955, which we actually just, I say we as if I'm an employee, just commemorated its beginning of the 65th anniversary on Friday.
And they're closed, which is intense. They were actually planning to reopen on the anniversary, but there was,
which I'm happy they didn't.
Me too. I'm really glad they didn't. But this, back when they were talking about it back in like late May, things were starting to look better, but then things have really gone downhill. So I'm glad that they changed their mind about that. They have opened downtown Disney, so people are buying all the 65th anniversary merchandise. So,
and if you're like me, I highly recommend just going to disneystore.com and ordering your stuff online. You just escape the crowds, and I've never had a problem with shipping. So
yeah, no
I'd
need to
say
go
for
down
now,
there.
just don't, if you can avoid it, just
For real.
wait it out.
Definitely. Okay, so Lady and the Tramp is my favorite. Whenever anybody asks, like, oh, what's your favorite Disney movie? I kind of have like classic, my childhood years, and then like more modern as like the genres. I think, well, it's hard to pick just one, but Lady and the Tramp's always been my first one. And I remember I didn't have a copy of Lady and the Tramp, but there was a copy at my grandma's house. So my favorite part about staying the night at my grandma's house was
watching.
Yes, there was a VHS, and I would sneak it into the room. The room that I got to sleep in had a little tiny TV. I mean, tiny, with a little. It had like the VHS into the TV, and I'd stay up and watch it once, and then I'd put it back on, like I rewind it, and then I'd fall asleep watching it the second time. And it was like every time I stayed there, that was what I looked forward to the most. Like, okay, I'm gonna go to bed.
By the way, just need to say, I think it's really interesting that our two favorite Disney films are 100% influenced by our grandmothers.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really cute. Because I'd never seen it till I was there. It was like, oh, it was like, I want a movie to watch, and like, what's this one? Like, the cover looked cute. I'd never had a dog, but I liked dogs.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this maybe influenced me to love dogs, because I always wanted a dog. I didn't get to have one till I was like 10, and we had a yard. But this movie, even in the beginning of this film, it's dedicated to dogs, and Walt Disney loved dogs. In fact, he had a lot of dogs in his life. Like when he was in France during World War II, during World War I, he had like a puppy that he used to carry around with him in his bag, and he'd sneak it in places like to his hotel. Actually, on Disney Plus, there's some extras, and there's a story of Walt talking about him and dogs, his relationship with dogs. It's really cool.
I'm glad you brought that up. Very quick, I'm glad you brought that up, because his bias towards dogs is as obvious as his bias towards like mother roles in his early films. Because I don't label myself as a cat person. I'm an animal lover. I love dogs and cats the same. Mm-hmm. But man, are some of the cats done dirty in some of these Disney films?
Yeah, in the original storyboard, I think there was a cat that was supposed to be living at the house with them, and it was like Lady. There's deleted scenes also at Disney Plus. Lady's like, I can't wait to get at you in a dark alley. Like, whoa, it's like a mischievous cat. Like there was this whole scene where like Darling made her wear this sweater that she hated, and she talked some horse into taking it off of her. And like he throws it in his cart because the horse's person is like collecting old clothes.
Yeah.
And the cat steals it back out of the cart and gives it back to Darling so she can put it back on the dog. Like it's just, yeah, cats are the villain. Even in this film, and we'll get there, we'll talk about it, but cats are the villain in this film as well. But he famously actually the very first scene in this film where Lady is given to Darling in a hat box, that's actually a true story he did with his wife. He wanted a dog so bad when he was first married, and his wife was not interested in dogs. She didn't want dogs. They shed on everything. They're dirty. So he read up on dogs, and he's like, oh, chows don't shed, and you know, all these things. And she's like, well, if we ever got a dog, I guess I'd want a chow. So for Christmas, he comes home with like a 6 or 8 week old chow in a hat box, and she was like, oh, you got me a hat. I don't like when people buy me hats. But the box started to move, and she screams, and it was this chow that she completely fell in love with. She loved this dog. I guess he lived about 14 years, and then they got dogs.
Dogs,
yeah, especially a bigger dog. Chows are pretty big.
I love that story. I love that it's based out of that.
They got dogs over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Ended up liking dogs. And then also with this film, famously, the most famous, like, or I'll ask you, Vasthi, what's the most famous scene in this film?
I'd say, iconic, because actually, yes, I would say the general population associates this famous spaghetti scene with Lady and the Tramp. For me, because I love Christmas, and the same like you, I always wanted a dog as a child. I actually accidentally became a cat person. I don't like saying dog person, cat person. I love all animals, but I ended up owning a cat way earlier. But I had these fantasies of like I would receive this hat box for Christmas and would come this puppy. So for me, that was always my favorite. That's what I associate is actually the hat box scene. But I mean, if I'm on a game show, I would have to say the spaghetti scene is more famous than that.
Okay, so that's, yeah, it's pretty iconic, but apparently Disney didn't like it. He thought it was too much of a stretch, that like dogs eating spaghetti together was just not gonna cut it. And
that was a stretch.
Yeah, right? He was like, no, it's not gonna work. So he cut it from the storyboard, but then directing animator Frank Thomas, he kind of saved the day because he, without talking to Disney, he animated it roughly and showed it to him, and Walt fell in love with it, and they put it in the film. So I thought that was really cool. It almost didn't make it in, and it's the cover of the box, the VHS,
and actually DVD. Every Valentine's Day for the past few years, the El Capitan screens Lady and the Tramp.
Yeah, it's so weird that it's such a romantic movie, and that's one of like the most romantic scenes in cinema. Like in general, it's referred to as one of the most romantic scenes in cinema, and it's two dogs eating spaghetti out the back door of a restaurant.
So I would actually highly recommend for any fans, super fans of Disney, of Lady and the Tramp, or if you're whoever you're with is a fan of that, I would say look out for that once, things start to get back to normal. Every Valentine's Day, for LA residents, there is a screening of Lady and the Tramp, and it's adorable. They have a cardboard cutout of the spaghetti scene. You could sit at a table, get your little photo up. It's adorable, and I recommend it. I loved it when I did it.
I've always wanted to go do that. Okay, maybe some other year.
Yeah. As soon as they started up, I'm sure people will be eager to do those things again.
So just in general, I love this movie because it's beautifully done. The animation's fantastic, and it's just like in the trailer, it was the longest trailer ever made. It was like 4 minutes long. But it really is it's a really happy film. Like, yeah, there's, some turmoil in the plot, but generally speaking, it's just such a fun movie. And there's just there's so many just adorable, awesome moments in this film. Like, I love it so much. And like the going to the zoo, it's just such a random side adventure, and you meet the beaver, and who, by the way, the gopher from Winnie the Pooh was actually completely based off of that character.
I didn't know that.
But like the whistle and everything, like they liked it so much they brought it over to Winnie the Pooh, the animated. So Gopher was based on the beaver in this movie. You'll also see cameos of several Lady and the Tramp characters in 101 Dalmatians.
Oh, yeah.
So like when the beginning, when the puppies are missing, and there's like I forget what it's called, but like the Twilight Bark Network or something, like the dogs are all barking to send a message. Like you see Jock trying to help out, and
I love it.
The old hound dog that's like later in the Twilight Bark that's based off of Trusty. So it's really cool. Like you see dogs, I'm like, oh, that was from Lady and the Tramp, and that was from Lady and the Tramp, and that was.
That's always fun to discover those little Easter eggs.
Yeah, I love it.
Go ahead.
Oh,
no, go on.
All right. So I was just gonna say Peggy Lee was the voice of, and I didn't know this, but Peggy Lee was the voice of Darling, and what else was it? Oh, the Trixie, or no, Peg. Sorry, Peg in the Pound. But she was also the voice of the two cats.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And she helped write. She sung all of the songs that makes it even worse, right? Yeah, no, it's like a white lady that's saying the cats, and their names are Cy and Am. To be Siam. So she helped write most of the songs. Okay. And she later sued Disney for breach of contract, claiming she didn't retain. Or just claiming that she still retained rights to the transcripts. And after like a really lengthy legal battle that ended in like 1991, they settled for like $2.3 million, which is crazy.
91?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think she took him to court till like 89 or something.
Yeah.
I didn't write that down, but as far as I remember.
Wow. I mean, it's her due. From what you just mentioned, I'm like, yeah, she should get everything she's deserved and more. But that's incredible, 1991. Because this movie came out in 1955.
Yeah, a little while later. Also, this
Wow.
was the first film ever released under Buena Vista Studios.
Okay.
And it was the first film, like animated film, done in the like widescreen. Also.
Oh, CinemaScope.
Yeah.
Would be the
And
one.
what were you gonna say? I didn't mean to cut you off. Really.
Oh no. I was just thinking like two of my favorite aspects of this film was the fact I've always been really fascinated by like that turn of the century era.
Mm-hmm.
That this is so very obviously filmed in, mainly because I don't know if you remember the American Girls books, but my favorite American Girl was Samantha, who came out of this Victorian era. So when I first watched this, I'm like, oh, the high boots and just the decor and everything about that turn of the century, I adored. And on the complete opposite side of the style that I liked, I related so much to Tramp at the time, and even kind of still, just because he's just this kind of, he's suspicious of anybody that is tied down to a family, or especially there's this classicism about him that he's just untrusting because he's been hurt. He would rather have his options, live free, be this free spirit, than to change who he is. And I'm not saying that as a kid I completely understood why he was that way, but that mistrust of like, oh, you have money, or oh, you live on that side of town, or this is where you come from, where at the same time I'm loving everything about the rich people in this film. I love the style, I love everything about it. And it's probably, just that fear of getting hurt, fear of getting rejected because you don't belong, or you think you don't belong in that home or in that environment. To me, there's just that layer that I love about Tramp.
Yeah, and it's kind of like almost a fear of commitment, right? Because he's
Mm-hmm.
been hurt. He says, I have lots of families, but none of them have me. I know it's not a direct quote, I'm paraphrasing, but it's interesting. He has all these relationships with different families. Like he has a Monday house and a Tuesday house,
Mm-hmm.
and he has different restaurants that he frequents. And he knows, in another deleted scene, he's teaching Lady how to kind of beg for food. Like about puppy dog eyes and I mean he's really got that down. He understands. It's one thing I love about his characters. He really understands humans and how they work and how they think and how they view dogs. Like the zoo scene when they're trying to sneak into the zoo and he tricks the cop into
no, this is my human. Yeah.
Right. And I love watching him in that scene because he's got all these different emotions and different things going on where he's excited. He's looking at the guy and he growls at the cop because the cop puts his stick, and then he, there's all these different things, but he completely understands how to manipulate humans.
And it's very reminiscent to the fox in Zootopia for those who have seen both. Like, yes, it's just about someone who got hurt, who instead of getting hurt again has chosen to manipulate the system and everyone around them. It's a protective layer. It's a defense mechanism. And I just think that layer of Tramp is just, I find so fascinating.
And she's so naive, like she's really sheltered, and I like the two worlds meeting, and they're good for each other, Mm-hmm. And I also like the animation style where everything's from the dog's point of view. Like you hardly ever see Jim faces, Darling or Jim and Darling's faces, right? Because you want to kind of keep it at their perspective, and I like that about the movie.
Can I talk about the pound scene and how upsetting that is? Every single time I watch this film, it brings me to tears. I've often told my friends how as much as I love animals, I can never foster just because I get attached too quickly. Mm-hmm. And the few times I have gone to the pound, it's heart-wrenching. I still think about some of the ones I've walked by. Like So even something that's animated, that's not real, I'm like crying over these dogs that, you know, everyone knows what happened. I mean, there's more and more no kill shelters, but it's so difficult. And it just brings me back to every time I've had to walk through a pound and make a choice. They're like, no, can I buy this whole building out and hire some staff to care for them is what I would do if I won the lottery. Very, you know, 101 Dalmatians. But no, that scene, as no matter how many times it wrecks me in a way that surprisingly Bambi doesn't, because I still understand that that's nature. There's some rules, things happen, it's wild. But this is so sad because it's humans locking dogs up, and I can't get over it every single time. I'm always surprised by how teary-eyed I get during that scene.
Yeah, it's heart-wrenching. And then it's such a juxtaposition because the musical number right there is so much fun. And you're just like heartbroken for these dogs, and they take Bugsy off to the door that's only one way.
Oh,
you know?
my God, yeah, I know.
And they're just kind of so flippant about it, like, oh yeah, well, that sucks. Like, oh man, they're taking him. Then he's never. It's I don't know. And then, but I guess maybe because it is so horrific, they had to, like, the actual reality of a pound, that they did have to add such a jaunty musical number in there to, like, liven up the.
Oh, yeah, very similarly, briefly going back to Bambi, when they go from one heart-wrenching scene to, like, oh, everybody's Twitter paid it. Like, it's, okay, we have to flip this, make this happy real quick.
Right.
Which is understandable, especially if you're aiming these films for kids. But it's still dealing with very adult things that are, you know, they're gonna spark up conversation, which I think is important. I mean, it's the reality. I grew up around stray dogs all the time. Especially in my area where I grew up, I would see dogs with cut leashes where people wouldn't even take their dogs to the pound. They would cheap out and just abandon them. And it was just infuriating, and it just I love that Jim Deere and Darling treat these animals like their own kids, because they're family. And that's at the end of the day, you know, pets are family. That's the lesson I take away from these things. And once I'm, you know, ready to commit to have a pet again, like, I'm all in, no matter how expensive those hospital bills are or whatever comes up. Like, you don't give them up just because it gets hard, you know?
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that you used the term "when I'm ready to commit," because a lot of people don't really take that into consideration. Like, I know when Game of Thrones was really popular, everybody was going out and getting huskies, and then learning that huskies are challenging, and then dumping them at the pound. Every Easter at the park where there's a lake, people dump baby ducks and stuff at the lake because they were like, oh, let's get babies, and then, like, oh wait, I can't actually have a duck or whatever.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a commitment. And
it is.
I in my world, I would like to think that Jim Deere and Darling continue to expand that family, and I trust that they would. I love how they're presented. I love that they believe Lady. They believe Tramp when things get a little hairy.
Yeah, unlike Aunt Sarah, who doesn't trust the dog, they trust her that she's.
There's got to be a reason.
Tell us something. Yeah. Okay, so I know we need to wrap up soon, but just two things I want to cover. I have a couple fun continuity errors that I want to talk about.
Oh, yeah. I love those.
I love stuff like that. So in the very beginning, when they have the puppy and Jim's trying to put her in the little bed in the kitchen, he puts down a newspaper, and then the newspaper's never there in any other shots. So
that's funny because it's just a blanket, right? I believe.
Well, yeah, her blanket's on the bed, but he puts a newspaper in front of her bed.
Oh, right next to it, yeah.
Yeah, and he's like, oh, gotta put the newspaper down. And then she leaves the bed and comes back, and you see her bed multiple times. There's no newspaper there.
Oh, that's fun. Yeah.
Tramp changes colors throughout the film. sometimes
to like
he's
gray to tan or
like in the picture behind me, he's kind of like tan and beige, and sometimes he's gray and like a light gray. So he kind of changes colors throughout the film, which is
and it's not about like shading or the lighting, because
yeah,
same with like you see Lady, like she's still like brown and tan.
Yeah, she stays pretty much the same color the whole time, so it's kind of weird.
That's pretty fun.
And then I read this, I didn't ever notice, but so in one of the later scenes where there's the rat in the upstairs bedroom, and so Lady's on a chain, and when she escapes, she runs upstairs, she has the chain. So, and then when she's at the door, no chain. And then when she runs over to the crib, the chain's back. And then when her and Tramp are looking at the baby and Aunt Sarah comes over, no chain. And then after she pushes Tramp into the closet, she has her chain again. So it's like there, not there, there, not there, there, not there. And I didn't believe that, and I actually went back and watched it, and I'm like, oh man,
that's funny.
So they quickly, just kind of forgot.
Before we wrap up, I feel like we have to address two things. The animated remakes, or I would say it's a wrong way to say live action because they're still animation. But there are Lady and the Tramp was remade and released straight to Disney Plus, and I want to know if you watched it and what your thoughts were on that, even though this isn't like the live action podcast, but I feel like it has to be addressed.
I did rewatch it, or I did watch the quote unquote live action version, and I've learned from these remakes to not expect the movie that I love.
Right.
So I kind of went into it with more of a open mind and a blank slate. Yeah, with lower expectations, or just to see what they did differently.
Right.
And there were some things I really actually liked that they did. I like that the cast was definitely much more diverse. Like Jim and Darling are a mixed race couple.
Oh, okay.
And it seems like this is set more in the South. So there's like just everyone in the film, like all the side characters, it's a much more diverse cast, which is really cool. And then something else we should discuss before we leave is it definitely got rid of the outdated cultural depictions, as they put it, like the disclaimer on Disney Plus when they have films like Peter Pan or this one. I actually wrote it down what the exact quote is.
For those wondering, yes, there are racist stains on some of the most popular Disney movies, and in this one it would be the stereotypical, very insensitive depiction of the Siamese cats, especially that they're very bucktooth, and
they're terrible accents, and they're very like Oriental sounding music,
and in the trailer they're referred to as Oriental. Along with the Chihuahua, who's very stereotypically kind of lazy, kind of slurred, and
that scene those characters were used, like Boris, the Russian dog, and the Chihuahua were used kind of in another like scene that was a deleted scene, and she actually is like goes after the Chihuahua, and she's like, I was gonna get that Mexican, and I was like, oh, I'm glad. Okay, that's they really were trying to have culture depictions. But the disclaimer that they have is, this program is presented as originally created. It may contain outdated cultural depictions.
I believe I've also read that on Dumbo with like the Jim Crows, and you mentioned.
Oh yeah. And Peter Pan, I loved Peter Pan growing up, but I hadn't seen it in a long time, and I remember showing it to a friend, and his whole take was like, so that racist Disney movie, and I was so heartbroken. I had no, kids don't understand. They're just presented something.
And even when you do discover it as an adult, there is this struggle with like the nostalgia part of you that loves this film, and the part that you understand that the root of it was wrong. Yeah. But at the same time, you're forever attached to what it meant to you as a kid.
Yeah, I love that scene. The Siamese cats. I love that scene. I love that song. It's such a fun moment, and they're so mischievous, and it's like I loved that part.
Yes.
And then it really is such a bummer that it's like really, really racially insensitive. And so this was released in 55. Now the Korean War had just ended in 53. It was like 50 to 53. So this is when like Asian stereotypes were rampant in the country. So this really, I feel like this is a accurate depiction of how people, the sentiment toward Asian cultures at the time.
Oh yeah, and I mean it didn't stop at that point. I mean, I think off the top of my head, like Breakfast at Tiffany's, for those who haven't seen it.
Mickey Rooney, yeah.
Mickey Rooney and Mr. Yuniyoshi, and it's something that needs to be acknowledged. I think it's something that I'm happy that Disney doesn't, that at least they acknowledge so far with the ones that we have mentioned of, you know, Dumbo, Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, and there's a couple, Fantasia.
Right. They're not removing them from their films. They're saying that this was how it was originally created, and it's not they're very PC language, but this is an okay depiction of things, but we're not going to edit ourselves because this is how things are. But like in the live action version, it's totally different kind of cats, a different song. They got to have a redo. And it definitely doesn't have it's not as catchy a song. Like I feel like they could have tried to make something a little bit more catchy and like, oh, this is just as fun. It was kind of like, it didn't have the charm.
I think what Disney's struggling with their live action is that the charm just isn't there in so many of these films. Like I think they've made more bad ones or more disappointing ones than ones that have knocked it out of the park. Personally, I could only think of like 2.
I think because they're trying to stay so close to the original with like little differences. Like, no, don't try to make the film the same. Like, for instance, I haven't gotten to see it yet because of the pandemic and Mulan not actually coming out. But I feel like I was so excited about Mulan because it looks so different than the
I'm hoping they're able to make it their own. Same.
It looked awesome. It looked like a badass movie, but that kind of followed the storyline of Mulan, but wasn't gonna try to, because you get too close, then it's like all you're gonna do is constantly compare. Like the live action Lion King is my other favorite Disney movie. They tried it was too similar, so every single moment
so shot for shot,
and it just didn't live up to it. So I think that's where their problem, personally, I think that's where their problem is. They need to like branch out and be like, we're doing a nod to our classic movie, but we're doing a new thing.
Or also just start making original stories again. Like there's so many stories to be told. And
well, there's that, but
I feel like they're just pumping it right now. It just seems like they've just run out of ideas, and it's frustrating to see. And yes, I'm taking a little bit personally that the latest remake that they're attempting, that was announced back in January, February, is Bambi, which I'm like, is nothing sacred. Do not do it. I'm still debating if I'm ever going to watch it just because I would assume it's going to look like either The Jungle Book or The Lion King, or it's just the charm is, and the art, it's just, I don't know. I'll have to wait and see. But I was not happy with that announcement. But one last note, right now that we did discuss some of the racial faux pas that Disney has made, and where I still associate a lot of the faux pas with like classic Warner Brothers films, acknowledging that Disney has had their stains. And I keep calling them stains because they're so inclusive on their image of family orientation, and you know, everybody grows up knowing Disney, whether you have been to Disneyland or Disney World or not. But one thing I hope they figure out how to approach is Song of the South, sorry, is something that they've chosen to hide and bury. And with the controversy of, you know, the way you described loving the Siamese cat song is how I felt about like Splash Mountain. It was just something that was associated with my going to Disneyland as a child, and then learning what it actually was once I was in college studying Southern folklore and history, really broke my heart. But at the same time, my association with that ride was just tapping into how it made me feel as an 8-year-old, being excited beyond belief. So I just hope that eventually Disney figures out a way how to tell the story of how Song of the South came to be and why it was wrong. Instead of just burying it and pretending it never happened.
Well, you heard they're burying it even further, right? They're actually going to be changing because of all the Black Lives Matter movements that have happened. They're changing the theme of Splash Mountain to Princess and the Frog.
Which, you know, I understand where that's coming from. I think eventually, I read that Bob Iger has said, like, it is something that needs to be addressed. When you do look into the history of how Splash Mountain came to be, it doesn't make any sense of, like, why would they make a ride based on a movie that they don't want to show us? And you look into it, it's very messy. It's all money based, and it's another discussion for another time. But it just, as Disney does acknowledge what they've done wrong in these disclaimers, I think they need to be called out. And they have been called out, but they need to finally address it, whether it's in a form of a documentary or a book or something. They just have to stop bearing this, because it's not going to go away. People are educating themselves more than ever, especially with this pandemic. People are really opening their eyes to past marketing, whether it's systematic racism or things that people have forgotten. It's something that they have to do. And I hope they do it within our lifetime. So I just felt it had to be mentioned while we were on the topic of racism and insensitivity and culturally acceptable and what was of its time.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that they're actually changing Splash Mountain. It always, I loved Splash Mountain, and you know, I still remember, like, I can sing the music in my head, and like when you're going up the steep hill and the like worrying and the rabbit and you know all this stuff, but I was always like, where is this from?
And like, it's something that's gonna always remain a mystery to me in terms of like the business side of it and the it opened in 1989. It's not like this was a ride that was built in 1955. And it's fascinating. Someone needs to make this documentary, whether it's Disney or not.
Really.
Disney, I'm calling you out. I'm just saying, you do it. You explain it, or somebody else will.
Yeah, I think it would be great coming from Disney. And I'm excited. Princess and the Frog and a new ride. It'll be like a whole new ride, and it still fits with the theme of like the New Orleans, the feel from over there, that side of Disneyland. The
expansion of New Orleans Square, but
the old fashioned like steamboat kind of thing.
But when you actually think about a systematic racism that's still within Disneyland, you have to also acknowledge what type of architecture is the Haunted Mansion. You know, it's probably a plantation.
Yeah.
You know,
honestly, I never really thought about that, but
when you think of
New Orleans Square, like it is the South, like, yeah.
And you think about, you know, when these steamships were happening, when the Pirates of the Caribbean were pirating, like this was all a very specific time, things that a lot of us haven't thought about. So yes, this is a step forward in terms of representation, but the root of it is still kind of there. And as long as it makes money, it's probably not going to be addressed. And at the end of the day, it's about money, and it's complicated, and it's enrooted in so many of our childhoods that, knowing all this, I still love Disney. I still love that part of my childhood that it taps into, because it just brings me it takes me back to that joy that I felt as an innocent child. So that's the struggle with that.
It's tough. I feel I really understand both sides of the argument. Like Pirates of the Caribbean, the ride, they've changed things. Like the men used to chase the women around in circles, and they changed it so the women are chasing the men. And like the whole auction scene, they changed, and that was really heartbreaking for me, because I'm like, that's the way things were, and this is a classic ride, and why are you messing with it? And like, people should, kids should understand how things were, and we can discuss it. But then again, like, I get it's a whole, we could have a whole other podcast discussion about this.
Absolutely. No, but I'm happy that you said that, because it's this struggle that all of us, you don't have to be this like, anyway, we have to discuss it another time, but it's something that's very, very fascinating. And going back to, the Disney films, it's something that has to be acknowledged, and you struggle with the two sides of the part of you that knows the context, and the part of you that's like, but I loved it as a kid. It makes me so happy. It still makes me so happy. But
I love Peter Pan so much, but it's uncomfortable a little bit.
Yeah, too, but anyway, at the end of the day, we're just human, and I love that we're discussing it, and it's blasted all of this into the forefront to, Walt Disney said Disneyland's never going to be finished. It's always going to be evolving. Same with these, films, these adaptations. So all in all, I'm still excited to see what's next, what we discuss next. And I'm happy that we had our Disney Day. And if you have any comments or tidbits or corrections or anything, please shoot us a comment or an email, or let us know.
Join the discussion.
Yes.
All right. On that note, our next episode, we're going to be discussing horror films. And with that, I'm going to recommend my favorite sci-fi horror from, I think it's like the 50s. I don't remember. I'll have to look it up. But the movie is called Them! Exclamation point.
Exclamation point. All right. And mine, I'm going to go way, way, way back to the 1920s and recommend Metropolis.
Ooh, I'm excited because I've heard of it and I haven't seen it. So I'm excited to check it out. All right. Go ahead, Vasthi, wrap us up.
Alrighty, so you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Be sure to check us out on our website at moviemenupodcasts.com. So until next time,
stay classy.